Now, a possible diplomatic breakthrough may be emerging in the ongoing conflict involving Iran, as Tehran says it's negotiating with Oman to reach an understanding that would allow commercial shipping to resume through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the announcement follows claims by Donald Trump that fresh talks aimed at ending the conflict are underway. Trump said he had postponed what he described as massive military strikes against Iran to allow diplomacy another chance. However, confusion remains one of the status of those negotiations. While President Trump insisted that discussions already taking place and described them as Iran's last chance to reach an agreement, Tehran has denied holding direct negotiations with Washington and says it has no plans to do so. Responding to Iran's public denial, Trump accused the country's leadership of being unbelievably duplicitous, while maintaining that negotiations do continue behind the scenes. According to Trump, the proposed agreement would include reopening the Strait of Hormuz, a global shipping route through roughly one-fifth of the world's oil goes through. Iran has repeatedly restricted access to the waterway since the conflict with the US and Israel escalated, disrupted global energy supplies and driving oil prices even higher. Trump also revealed that planned US military action over the weekend was called off following appeals from key regional allies, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who urged Washington to give diplomacy more time. Where he expressed confidence that an agreement could be reached not only on Hormuz, but also on Iran's nuclear program, although he declined to provide a deadline for any deal. Now, financial markets reacted positively to the prospect of renewed diplomacy. Global oil prices fell sharply in Asian trading, while Brent crude dropped more than 4% as investors anticipated a possible easing of tensions in the Gulf. But despite the optimism, commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz remains well below normal levels. Industry data indicates vessel traffic has declined significantly in recent days as shipping companies continue to monitor security risks in the region. Now, previous attempts to negotiate an end to the conflict have repeatedly broken down, with ceasefires collapsing and military exchanges resuming. While the White House maintains that diplomatic channels remain open, Iran continues to publicly reject claims of direct talks with the United States. The conflict has also become a political issue in the United States, as recent opinion polls suggest that public support for the war has declined, with many Americans questioning its objectives and economic consequences. Now, for now, the world is watching closely to see whether diplomacy can prevent further escalation and restore stability to one of the world's most important regions. Well, to discuss this, we're joined by the maritime security and geopolitical expert, Dr. Ian Rowby. Sir, hello, and once again, welcome back to Perspectiva. So President Trump says new talks with Iran could lead to a deal, while Tehran denies direct negotiations with Washington. How should we understand these conflicting statements?
Well, I think this entire conflict has been characterized by back and forth statements that haven't added up or lined up with each other. We've heard the President of the United States announce all kinds of things that have turned out not to be quite based in as much reality as we would hope. And similarly, Iran has made a lot of statements that have been clearly untrue. And so we see back and forth information operations, as we often call them, between the two governments, trying to sway the narrative and hopefully bend reality to meet that narrative. Unfortunately, that's not really worked for either side, although Iran has had more success in terms of making statements like the Strait of Hormuz being closed meet with some degree of reality than the United States saying it's open and free, meeting with the welcome arms of the shipping industry, which has said, no, unfortunately, it's not open if we're going to get attacked. And so with regard to these negotiations, it is very unusual to have this degree of acrimony when it comes to statements around the existence of diplomacy, much less the content of it. And so that points to the fact that we're probably very far from a negotiated agreement, because if we can't agree on whether we're even negotiating or not, it indicates that we may not be anywhere near to finding common ground. And while we do have the 18th of June and the MOU to point to as indications that negotiations can lead to something, the utter breakdown of that memorandum of understanding and the whole 60-day window that would have led to a full and final peace settlement indicates that the parties have backed off of that. And what has happened in the interim has created all kinds of new grounds for conflict. There's a lot more acrimony now than there was then. And there are a lot of recriminations around who has attacked ships, who has attacked bases, who has killed both soldiers and civilians. And that is likely to prolong the extent of the hostilities and including now the challenge of having new parties. We have the Houthis having resumed hostile aggression towards shipping and towards Saudi Arabia. We have the unattributed attack on the infrastructure and ships in Egypt. We have the intersection of the Iran war with the Ukraine war, where the Ukrainian forces actually attacked a Iranian vessel with an Iranian crew, killing one of the crew members, carrying Iranian weapons to support Russia in its war effort to overtake and diminish the sovereignty of Ukraine. So there are all kinds of factors now, and it seems almost nostalgic back to when we only had 3 or 4 countries in the mix. And so it's going to be a long, hard process to even get everyone to the negotiating table openly and clearly, much less get to the substance of those negotiations.
So how realistic is the possibility of reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and what would it mean for global energy markets and international trade?
So the Strait of Hormuz is going to be very, very difficult to bring back to its pre-February 28th, 2026 level. There are a lot of factors in this. One is the reality that, first of all, the war is not over. Despite all of the statements about war having ended with the ceasefire, the fact is that there's ongoing prolonged hostilities between the two states of the US and Iran. There's also hostilities between various other states, especially Israel and Iran, but also Iran and Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and others. And so this is going to be difficult just to untangle all the different aspects. And as long as those aspects remain tangled, the Strait of Hormuz is very much in play. And Iran has indicated no interest in relinquishing its newfound control over the strait. If we go back in time to 1982, when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was initially established, providing the global constitution and framework for how our oceans are governed, Iran decided not to ratify the convention. The reason was that they did not want to give up the possibility of exerting sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz. That is the reason they're not part of the international law. That is exactly what they're now trying to do today. And it is interesting that the United States is also not a party. And so the two countries that have been most in play regarding the access through the strait are not parties to the regime that would require that strait to be managed as an international strait. In other words, no direct control by either of the two coastal states, only the support to coastal state obligations like search and rescue, oil spill response, and the like. So what this means is that Iran is now seizing this opportunity to, having now effectively closed the strait, to establish not just a degree of physical aggression towards ships that go through, but a whole management scheme that they're trying to negotiate with Oman in order to have long-term say about who comes through, who doesn't, what cargoes come through, what don't, who gets checked, who doesn't, what requirements there are for any vessels transiting, all of which are inconsistent with international law, but international law to which Iran has specifically objected since it was established in 1982. So this is a complicated situation from a legal standpoint, and from a practical standpoint. The Iranians have demonstrated the capacity not only to bureaucratically administer the strait, but to back up that bureaucracy with use of force against vessels. In the last several days, we have seen 4 successful attacks that have persuaded vessels to change course. And all 4 of them were going through that southern corridor protected by the United States. It is an indication that Iran will not back down, and in fact is increasing its hostility. Just today, we have a seafarer that is missing, a vessel that's on fire. It's a very grim picture for the mariners who are responsible for carrying 90% of world trade. And certainly the Strait of Hormuz has become the most dangerous epicenter of global conflict, not just in terms of the states that are fighting, but also the commercial merchant vessels that are going through. And that is a chokehold that the Iranians are unlikely to relinquish.
Well, Iran has involved Oman in discussions over a temporary shipping arrangement. What role can mediators play in preventing further escalation?
Yeah, I think the Iranian-Omani discussions are quite interesting. Oman initially, for a while, negotiated with the International Maritime Organization to open up a transit corridor along the southern route, co-located with the U.S. protected route that the U.S. NCAGS program offers. Now, interestingly, that only lasted about 24 to 48 hours because of Iranian attacks against ships going through. Now, all the ships that were attacked during that period were under U.S. protection, not under the Oman IMO scheme, but nevertheless, it was deemed too dangerous to continue. And so since then, Oman has continued to negotiate with Iran about the possibility of co-management of the strait. Now, that is specifically provided for in the 18th of June MOU between the US and Iran. Admittedly, that MOU has been completely abandoned, but it does seem that the parties had at least some kind of Iranian Omani management scheme in mind at that point. And so what we're seeing now is discussions about how to bureaucratically control the strait. Now, that is out of line with international law. It's out of line with the principles of both freedom of navigation and uniformity, which provide for all of the maritime waterways of the world to be managed in the same way so that free flow of maritime commerce can move unimpeded by any one state's desire to do one thing or another. That is really important for our global trade, our global economy. Everyone feels it when any choke point, no matter where it is in the world, is impeded by something, whether it is bureaucratic, legal, administrative, or physical. And so all of that makes a difference to all of us because our trade is entirely dependent on this free flow. But what we are now seeing is seemingly an attempt to create some kind of mechanism for the long term that would allow the flow to at least resume. Now, they're calling it temporary. That is good because hopefully it is only a short-term measure to allow for resumption of trade. And we do have some evidence from the Iranian side that this kind of bureaucratic management scheme could work. The majority of the vessels that have come into and out of the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf since the breakdown in the MOU have all come through the Iranian route. So that indicates that the Iranians are seen as, at least among some of the shipping lines, as a trusted party to be able to manage that. And with the Omanis involved, it might reopen flows on either side. Now, interestingly, none of this is in discussions around the original transit passage through the strait that has existed for decades, if not centuries, in terms of that central corridor where we now have concerns about mines having been laid. So the main route through the Strait of Hormuz that was used for generations is not open. And that's just a physical fact. But the Iranian corridor and the Omani corridor, hugging their respective coastlines, are the two that are being used at the moment. The Iranians tend to attack the southern one, but permit the movement through the northern one. And if the two states on either side can come to some kind of agreement, maybe we can get a little bit of resumption of trade through that critical choke point.
Well, Trump says he's delayed major military action to give diplomacy a chance. Does this indicate a shift in military pressure towards negotiations?
No, it doesn't really indicate much. We've heard the president make all kinds of very bold military-related claims in the past and then back off of them. And there's no real evidence that anything changed other than the rhetoric out of Washington. So I don't think that we can put a whole lot of stake in it. You may recall back in April, the president was threatening to end the civilization. He claimed that a particular Tuesday was going to be Bridges Day and Power Electrical Day combined in one. And a lot of these statements are not only illegal under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and under some of the ceasefire agreements that have been agreed to along the way, they're also potentially venturing into the realm of concerns around war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, given the extent of the rhetoric. And so it's actually comforting that every time they're made, they tend to be backed off. So hopefully we are just seeing another ploy in the so-called art of the deal in terms of attempting to negotiate, and certainly maximalist positions followed by retractions based on some kind of indicator of movement is something that the president has documented as being his approach in real estate negotiations. And so maybe he's just trying to transpose that and apply that in an international relations context. Unfortunately, people's lives are very much at stake in this case rather than people's money. And so it does make a very different calculus in terms of how people respond and how it's viewed. But nevertheless, it does seem that that is the negotiating attempt.
So previous ceasefires and diplomatic efforts have collapsed. What are the biggest obstacles preventing a lasting agreement between Iran and its opponents?
There are a lot of obstacles now. And I think the number one obstacle is the will of all the parties. It does not seem that there is an active interest in peace on the part of the majority of the parties. In fact, there's sort of growing rabble-rousing, saber rattling towards increased war when you look at the expansion of this conflict across the region and merging with the region to the north. There's unfortunately no clear end in sight because we keep adding pieces to the puzzle and making it very, very difficult for it all to fit together. When it was the US, Israel, and Iran, it was difficult enough. When it is now the US, Israel, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Yemen, the Houthis separate from Yemen, and beyond, we have a situation where it becomes very difficult to see how all the parties who are aggrieved, who have experienced violence, who are in some ways involved now, can come to a resolution. And what we're likely to see is in response to the U.S. rhetoric, the U.S. claims, some kind of pushback. And the Iranians are escalating in response to the U.S. escalation. And that escalation has included not only the asymmetric attacks against ships, but now the sort of green light for the Houthis to get involved. And the Houthis are a wild card that could spoil all of the peace negotiations, given their much more brazen and chaos-loving style. They do not mind getting bombed. They do not mind creating a mess. And so they're likely to be a little bit more erratic in their behavior and less predictable than the highly predictable Iranian activities have been. And so that is a new element. And then add on top of that, Iran's long-range capabilities, not from a military standpoint, but from a cyber standpoint. We haven't seen any of that really getting the attention that it perhaps deserves. Iran has a history of cyber attacks that have had huge impact elsewhere on water systems, on critical infrastructure. And we've seen them attack in the United States in the past. And it seems that they've just done that recently. And so we could see a huge escalation in terms of the impact that's being felt on the American public, which is already beleaguered, tired, and unimpressed by the overall situation. And this is a critical time for the US, which may lead to more erratic, more aggressive behavior on the part of the administration. So we have a really difficult path ahead because the signs don't point towards peace at the moment. They do not point towards diplomacy. They do not seem to include the expertise needed and the diplomatic acumen needed to bring all the parties together and resolve the critical issues. It's one thing to bring people together, and I have to give Pakistan enormous credit for having been the party most successful in bringing everyone together. But if the right experts are not at the table, you end up with agreements like the MOU that do not have substantive value, that they don't make sense. There are a lot of things about that MOU that, from my standpoint and from anybody who knows the maritime situation standpoint, looked at it and said, this is going to fail. And so until we get to the point where there are seasoned, not just negotiators from a business standpoint, but negotiators from the substantive standpoint around some of these critical issues, that can come in and look at the material, look at the issues, and point to what the options are, we're likely just going to have window dressing on ongoing grievances that just bring us back to what everybody knows best, which is to fight and lash out. So unfortunately, it's hard to see a path towards peace at the moment.
Well, how could a prolonged conflict in the Gulf affect oil prices, regional economies, and global energy security?
This is getting really worrying for the future of the world's economy. The the reason that we have not seen a critical breakdown in the global economy over the last 5 months is that we've had artificial means creating a lower demand and making up for some of the shortage of supply. Prior to the 28th of February of this year, about 29% of global crude oil supplies that moved by sea came out of the Gulf. That is an enormous amount, a very important amount. Overall, about 20% of global energy supplies coming out of there. And it speaks to the actions that were taken afterwards, that we did not see prices go higher than they did. They peaked at about $119, $120 a barrel. Whereas I think many experts expected it to go to $150 to $200, maybe even $250 a barrel, based on the consequences of taking that supply offline. But China depreciated their demand enormously. They decreased it so much that it took away some of that burden. And so the shortfall wasn't that much of a shortfall suddenly. Additionally, the US increased its supply, its production, that helped, and it tapped into critical reserves. Now it has depleted those critical reserves to the point that they're down to the 1983 level. They're very low and getting lower. And that brings us to the point that the president of the United States made on the 18th of June when he signed that MOU, saying we were only 4 weeks away from running out of critical reserves. That's a very, very frightening statement, because if those ran out and if the US production couldn't be increased anymore, and if China then suddenly increased its demand again, there would be no way to make it up. And that would send the price skyrocketing. So now let's fast forward from the middle of June to where we are now. And we have a new crisis, because not only have gas prices started to go back up, fuel prices going up, crude availability going down. The problem is that when you have a one choke point crisis, you can kind of manage around it. You can figure out ways, you can find alternatives. But as the alternative, becoming the Red Sea, became more attractive, the Houthis have entered the mix. And that has brought us to a two choke point crisis, where both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb are closed. If the Saudi oil cannot get out to Asia, where most of it ends up going, we have a real problem, because it has to go through the Suez, which can only take vessels of certain sizes, and then around Africa or around the rest of the world to get to Asia. That's very expensive, increases the price, increases the cost, increases the impact on consumers of everything, because as fuel goes up, the price of everything goes up. But we have another concern with the attack this past week on Damietta in Greece. There's a concern that the Suez could potentially become a third choke point in this overall crisis. What that could mean is that if we do not have any access point for getting Middle Eastern oil out into the global market, 20% of energy supplies being offline is horribly catastrophic, especially as we head towards the winter months going into the autumn. That is potentially a breakdown in the global economy at a level we really haven't seen. So not only could oil hit $250 a barrel, but we could see shortages leading to very cold experiences, breakdowns in other things. And some factories, mechanics, machinery need continual operation in order to be maintained. And so it isn't just a quick on-off switch. If you turn it off, it can potentially never come back on. And so depending on what we're looking at and where we're going, we're going to have to start prioritizing and almost rationing national level supplies of oil and gas in order to ensure that critical infrastructure continues to operate and that societies do not break down fully. So this is, I don't want to be a harbinger of doom and gloom, but this is potentially a very, very difficult year ahead, because if this situation continues in its current trajectory, it doesn't end well for any of us.
With growing political debate within the US over its cost and objectives of the war, how much domestic pressure is influencing Washington's approach?
Well, there's a huge amount of domestic discord in the United States around the war in Iran. We have not only seen soldiers coming home in caskets, we've also seen sort of manipulation of the numbers about how many are being killed, how many are being wounded, how many are facing life-changing injuries. And that doesn't sit well with the American public, nor does it sit well with the fact that we're seeing prices rising again after so many promises of peace, of winning, of victory. And it's very hard to feel that victory when it feels like we're all losing. And so the American public is already beleaguered from 20 plus years of war. We have seen with Iraq and Afghanistan a very long, hard effort to try to not only achieve a victory, but also exit. And in both cases, I don't think many Americans feel we came out winning, especially Afghanistan, where the exit just opened the door to the return of the Taliban. And so a lot of us are, I think, in the position of being confused. What are we even fighting for? At least with Iraq and Afghanistan, we had an understanding of what the narrative was, and it was a consistent narrative. In Afghanistan, we were trying to go after those who perpetrated the attacks on the United States on the 11th of September of 2001. In Iraq, we were trying to go after the weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to exist, but which ostensibly posed a legitimate, credible threat to the national security of the United States. In the case of Iran, I don't think many have understood it, because we've heard over just a period of 5.5 months so many different justifications that have kind of never have a nuclear weapon. But that hasn't necessarily made everyone feel comfortable. And so it is likely that there's going to be increased public pressure against the administration to try to end this war, but it does not seem that the administration is all that persuaded by that public pressure. So we'll see what happens.
And looking ahead, what are the possible scenarios? A negotiated settlement, continued confrontation, or a wider regional conflict?
Well, something has to change. So one of the puzzle pieces has to shift in a way that moves us towards peace. And that could be a change in the personnel that are involved, a change in who's mediating, a change in one of the situations, an escalation that goes too far for everybody's tolerance. So until we see some kind of critical moment of change, it is unlikely that we're going to see any real movement towards a negotiated settlement. But we have to hope that number one, cause is found to bring us towards peace, an active peace, a peace that is preferable to what we have in just the absence of violence. Number two, we have to hope that the expertise and acumen needed to negotiate these critical issues around the maritime issues, around the military issues, and around the nuclear issues are actually brought into the mix, so that some kind of agreement is actually durable, that makes sense, and that has the foundational elements and principles involved in it. And finally, we have to hope that there's a restoration of humanity, where we all recognize that peace is actually in our best interest, no matter how boring it may seem to not have the excitement of war. War is far less preferable to peace. And that is something that we all have to remember. And hopefully those who are suffering, who have been attacked, whether they're seafarers, innocent civilians, or even the soldiers who have no part in making decisions around this, are able to find a bit of peace and relief from the incredible stress and strain that these last 5.5 months have held, and in the case of Ukraine, the last 4.5 years have held. So we have to pray for peace, and hopefully something will change to bring us there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, that is all for today's edition of Perspectiva. Our thanks go to our guests for sharing their views on Kashmir Exploitation Day and for shedding light on Iran and Oman's understanding regarding the Strait of Hormuz management. Please, for more stories and updates, follow us on social media or visit Asia One News TV. I'm Philpot. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.